Welcome, everybody. My name is Julie Rosa, and I am the First Amendment Specialist here at Iowa State University. You are joining us in a Zoom session, the first of four, actually, that we have today, as part of our First Amendment Workshop series, which is rounding out our week of First Amendment days, celebrating the First Amendment all this week with all sorts of activities going on, including yesterday's Feast on the First, which was held out on Central Campus during gale force winds, but we all survived, and we all got to exercise our freedom of speech, shall we say. So welcome to today's session. We have a stimulating conversation that will be presenting to you the case against free speech and the First Amendment. So I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Brian Steffen from Simpson College here in just one moment. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, we are recording this session, so you can be aware of that. Secondly, I wouldn't wait to hold on your questions. I would pop those in the chat as we go along, because we need to wrap up right at 9:50 Iowa time. And so we'll probably start to wind down at about 9:45. So don't wait, pop those questions in the chat. We'll make sure they get answered, or at least asked. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate it very much. Good morning, everyone. And yes, I'm about 50 miles down the road from Julie, and we had gale force winds yesterday. If anyone doubts that Iowa is the wind power capital, probably of the world now, I think this early spring has solved that mystery as to why we have so many wind turbines here. But we have, I think, an enormously provocative and informative next several minutes coming up here. And let me give you the genesis for my pitching a panel discussion on the case against free speech. I'm a longtime journalism professor here at Simpson, and was a working journalist for many years before that. And so I, of course, have a lot of value of the First Amendment and the values of free speech. But the past, I would say, most importantly, last 10 years or so, there has been more and more, shall we say, questioning. I think less of the existence of free speech and more of what that means, and should we be more critical of it. So what I did last year is, as part of our honors program at Simpson College, I actually proposed to teach a class that will be now taught next fall called The Case Against Free Speech. And I looked high and low for people who had some interesting things to say. And I found a couple of them, and then I invited them both to join us today. And I'm very appreciative that they took the time to be with us. We're going to hear first today from Anthony Leaker, who probably is the first time we've had a First Amendment Week speaker join us from the United Kingdom. So thank you, Anthony. Anthony teaches in the Center for Applied Philosophy, Politics and Culture at the University Brighton in the United Kingdom. And he is the author of this book, Against Free Speech, which is, again, as I say, provocative, and I think raises some very important questions about why we have free speech, but more importantly, the entire project of liberal democracy. So we're going to hear from him first this morning. Our other speaker, when he gets a chance to speak, is Keith Whittington, who is the Wilson Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University, and the author of this book, Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. And as you might expect from the title, it's a full-throated defense of the values of free speech and why universities should respect those values. So gentlemen, thank you both today. Anthony, how are things in Brighton today?
Incredibly sunny, which is quite unusual for Britain this time of year, but yeah, very sunny and warm. So we did have some strong winds a couple of weeks ago. Maybe they'd come. I don't know if they're related to your winds, probably not, but yeah, not.
Well, I know you've had some very nasty winter storms on occasion this winter in the UK with incredibly high winds. So we get a little feel for what those are like for you. Anyway, Professor Leaker, thank you for joining us virtually here in Iowa and in the United States. Could you give us a summary of your book, Against Free Speech?
Yeah, I will try. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and yeah, it's a real honor to to speak to you all. I'm just going to set my timer so that I don't go on too much, but do stop me if I do go on too much. So firstly, I should say, you'd notice at the top of the title was the book series is Polemics. So the title is polemical, and just to clarify and hopefully not disappoint, I'm not entirely against free speech. The argument is against free speech in inverted commas. So the main argument of the book is that free speech has been used, especially in Britain and the United States, as an ideological tool, as a kind of smokescreen and as a Trojan horse to kind of bring in a whole set of what I perceive to be reactionary ideas that one would have hoped wouldn't get an airing anymore in the 21st century in liberal democracy, so-called liberal democracies, i.e. free speech is a tool for legitimizing racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia. You get some very famous cases of people building entire careers as free speech martyrs who, Milo Yiannopoulos is one that springs to mind, but in Britain, Tommy Robinson, I dare say, in a sense, your former president, Donald Trump, also used free speech in a way, as a way of becoming almost a hero or a martyr by supposedly bravely speaking these truths that everyone was afraid of and that politically correct or woke mob had silenced. And my view is that it's all nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Free speech has been historically the preserve of the ruling elite, and it still is to this day. That what we need to examine is not the principle of free speech, which is very hard to argue against the principle of free speech. It's a great principle. It's a fantastic principle, just as the principle of liberal democracy is a great principle. But the reality of British society, and I would argue also of the way the United States functions, is that there are tremendous power imbalances, not just economical power imbalances, but they're very obvious, and that's very important for free speech arguments because it's about platforms and who's able to amplify their voice. And it's not a free marketplace of ideas, never has been, unlikely to ever be. It is not a marketplace of ideas. It doesn't exist. Maybe it exists in the seminar space in Iowa State or in Princeton, but it does not exist in the public sphere. The public sphere has been completely eroded and undermined by the power of certain let's use the word oligarchs, but also the media. The British media is largely owned by Rupert Murdoch and a couple of other people you won't even have heard of, but the Barclay brothers, they're incredibly powerful figures. That's one argument. There's a kind of orchestrated campaign by very powerful people to use free speech as a tool in order to kind of legitimize their ideas. And it takes us away from the reality of the situation. The reality is we live in a deeply unequal world. And so, yeah, economically it's unequal, but also structurally. So I believe strongly that structural racism exists, structural sexism exists, and structural heteronormativity, let's call it that. There's a complete imbalance in who gets to speak, in whose voices are heard, in whose voices are taken seriously, and it privileges the same people that it's always privileged. So I think that's what we need to tackle. And having a discussion about the principle of free speech is all well and good within a given community or a given setting. And I've got a lot of sympathy for the arguments that Professor Whittington makes with regards to the university. I actually wouldn't take issue with many of the arguments in themselves. I would take issue with the whole, which is, have you seen the reality of liberal democracy in America in the 21st century? It's a joke. I mean, it's a farce. It's completely controlled by money and all sorts of other things. So yes, we need free speech to defend democracy, but until something's done about this grotesque inequality that rules our world, I can't see the point of even talking about free speech. I think, well, no, I do see the point, but I think it's a massive smokescreen. So that, broadly speaking, is my argument.
Excellent. Thank you, Anthony. And I'm sure we'll get more into that. Keith, you've written the book, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Can you give us a summary of your arguments there?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, the book is concerned with trying to walk through some traditional principles and concerns and lessons of the tradition of free speech in liberalism in particular, and then use those principles to try to then think through the specifics of the university context, why we might care about those kinds of commitments, specifically in universities, which I think is a different argument than why we care about them in society as a whole. For example, there are particular reasons associated with democracy and how democracies work that give us some important reasons for wanting to protect free speech in lots of other contexts. But in a particular university context, there's a concern being able to protect the ability of people to ask difficult and controversial questions and pursue unpopular answers to those questions. Universities, to the extent that they are committed to trying to advance human knowledge and convey what we know to a wider audience, whether that wider audience includes the students, fellow scholars, the general public. Universities need to be spaces in which controversial ideas can be taken seriously, looked at carefully, and we can follow the arguments and evidence where we think they ought to take us. And so then I try to use those principles and that sort of basic commitment of universities to try to walk through some particular kinds of controversies that now are occurring on college campuses and try to help think through how we ought to try to resolve some of those. Let me just note a couple of things that are worth distinguishing that I probably don't do enough in the book to talk about, but is very much on my mind these days, in part because of other activities I'm concerned with, but in part because of some of the particular controversies that are becoming particularly heated over the last year or last few months, and I think are going to be very prominent over the coming years, unfortunately. So I'm now chair of the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is a advocacy group of a cross-ideological group of professors concerned with protecting academic freedom in the United States. Academic freedom we might think of as free speech adjacent. It's not quite the same thing as free speech, has some important distinctions between it, but there's also an important a set of principles that are operative in American universities to try to protect critical inquiry in general. So the book talks both about some academic freedom issues, which in particular is concerned with the freedom of professors to explore controversial topics in their classrooms without fear of university reprisal or sanction for having done so, and to publish potentially controversial research, again, without fear of sanction or reprisal from their university employer for having done so. Those come with some boundaries and limitations on them as well. And so the expectation in a classroom, for example, is that you're engaged in professionally competent speech that is germane and relevant to the subject matter in which you're teaching. You have a captive audience as a professor in a classroom, and you can only use that audience for specific purposes. And the university can quite reasonably sanction faculty who are abusing that particular platform and how they're using it in those particular contexts. But to the extent that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is dealing with the particular subject matter at hand, there is an expectation that they may engage in quite controversial conversations in dealing with that subject. And what you don't want is universities shutting down those discussions because they're seen as too controversial. Moreover, there's a third element of academic freedom protections as they get pitched in the United States that really extends into larger free speech protections. Is true of other members of the campus community as well, which is the ability of faculty to express their political views in public forums, also without fear of reprisal or sanction from their university employers. This does not rest on their particular expertise in a subject matter as faculty, but simply their ability to express their own personal political opinions in other contexts. And we see faculty in the United States now being attacked on both dimensions, both on what they can do in the classroom, what kind of research they can do, but also for expressing controversial views in public that people disagree with. And so one reason why this is, I think, a particular concern at the moment is we're seeing in particular increasing legislative pressure on what kinds of topics can be taught in classrooms, what kinds of books can be assigned in classrooms, what kinds of ideas can be expressed. There are now suggestions by some state politicians in the United States that we ought to eliminate tenure protections entirely in order to make it easier to fire faculty who might say something controversial or something that politicians disagree with on public university campuses. And so I think we have a real fight in front of us over the coming years as to what the future of American universities really look like. Are there places where you can take ideas seriously, places where we are open to hearing a range of controversial views, including views that the local community or politicians might not want students or faculty to hear, let alone escape into the larger public. American universities have struggled over the last 100 years to really establish themselves as core intellectual centers, not only of American life, but of the world broadly. But whether they remain committed to that in the coming years really does depend upon to what degree they remain places in which we are committed to the idea that we're willing to hear controversial ideas on college campuses and explore them and criticize them freely without boundaries being set on the scope of those inquiries by outside politicians.
Thank you, Keith. And let me also thank Julie, our host. Julie Rosa has posted in the chat links to the books that our guests have written that I think are just fabulous statements of these core principles. And I already see that as well that we're getting some questions in the live chat as well. So we will go to those in a few minutes. Anthony, I want to come back to you, and I'm going to read back to you a section of your book that I think is really interesting and is something that at least I, having studied and taught free speech for 4 years, had not thought of, and maybe get you to explore that. You say that free speech purists, quote, argue that free speech is essential for challenging dogma, received opinion, and entrenched ways of thinking. And yet they are stuck within a dogmatic, entrenched reactionary conception of free speech and ignore, dismiss, or strawman many of this and the last century's most significant political, philosophical, and theoretical developments that have reconceptualized how we might and can think about language, power, and the human subject. And I take it that you're talking about such developments as post-structuralism, postmodernism, feminist and racial critiques of power and society as well. I think that a lot of the, I guess, the theory of free speech really, goes back to Milton and Mill, and here in the United States, Justice Holmes, and the marketplace of ideas metaphor. And those theories developed, I guess, I'll say ignorant, but not stupidly ignorant, just weren't aware of later developments in these theories of language and power and who has freedom and who doesn't have freedom. Could you expand on that a little bit, Anthony? I thought that was a fascinating point of view.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah. Okay, so, firstly, I should say, free speech purists are a particular group of people I could identify, but most famously in Britain would be people who work for an online magazine called Spiked, which I won't go into, but they are very much campaigners. They've done a tour in the US of US campuses, a free speech tour. They've got a lot of support, and they're what's the word? They're provocative. They write very, very provocative, let's say controversial headlines all the time. So that would be the most extreme example of what I mean by purists. I could think about others, but anyone who would argue for free speech absolutism, basically. But who are the advances in intellectual thought I'm thinking of? Less postmodernism, post-structuralism, yes, but also the linguistic turn in philosophy. So someone like Wittgenstein, and then the stuff that comes after Wittgenstein. So analytical philosophy of language. And yeah, some of that would be feminist philosophy of language, where they look at how language operates. And it's not that they conflate speech and action, because I recognize what Professor Whittington says about, conflating speech. There's a good section in your book. Keith, can I call you Keith? Is that right?
Of course.
Where you highlight the dangers of just very broadly conflating speech and action, and that doesn't lead anywhere useful if you're just saying that violent speech is the same as violent action. It's not. But what the philosophy of language has demonstrated quite successfully, to my mind, is that speech can enable or set up the conditions that can lead to physical violence. The case in Rwanda is a really famous one. Lynn Terrell, philosopher of language, writes about that, how 6 months prior to the genocide, there was a kind of propaganda campaign, basically, which dehumanized the Hutus, and that led to the I can't remember if it was Hutus or Tutsis, so that's terrible of me, but it was a mass dehumanization process, and that was done through language, that language can lead to the conditions of dehumanization, which can in turn lead to horrendous violence. And in my view, these free speech purists, many, not even solely free speech free speech purists, the liberal defense of free speech, someone like Timothy Garton-Ash, who wrote a big book in defense of free speech, came out about 2 or 3 years ago, a British liberal establishment figure, they just ignore that. They say, oh, the best recourse for dealing with hate speech is counter speech. And I just don't see the evidence for that. It just seems an incredibly short-sighted, almost insulting argument. Like, it doesn't work. I mean, if the force of power is on the side of the person who's making the hate speech, i.e. if it's a kind of an expression of white supremacy, and they have an entire set of history, an institution behind them and history behind them, and then trying to counter that in a forum that's already stacked against the victim, I just think is nonsense. But yeah, I think that post-structuralism and philosophy of language have shown very successfully, in my view, how language is much more than someone like Milton or Mill thought. And that's not to blame Mill, like Mill's great, and actually Mill's argument in The Subjection of Women recognizes structural, the subjection of women recognizes structural power. He doesn't use that power differentials. He doesn't use that language, but he recognizes that it's not good enough to just say, women are equal to men, therefore they should be able to participate in democracy. No, because the surrounding kind of ideology in British society at the time disadvantaged them so much so that they just, they wouldn't be able to enter into the marketplace of ideas. I mean, it's a brilliant argument. I think Mill's great, but he doesn't think about language. They just take it for granted that language is basically a transparent window on the world. And I don't think it is a transparent window on the world. I think language does play a role. It's constitutive. That's, I guess, the main argument. Language constitutes how we see things. I don't think language is just straightforwardly representational. It does work. If we could think about Russia-Ukraine conflict now, if you use the word conflict, that's going to have a different set of ramifications than invasion, war. It's tremendously significant, the language that's used. So yeah, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Keith. I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that from your perspective, but I'm reminded in listening to this to a law review article I read many years ago as a PhD student. It was by Frederick Schauer, and it was titled The Ideology of the First Amendment. And his argument was that the First Amendment in America exists to permit people to question any orthodoxy except the orthodoxy of the doctrine of the First Amendment, which again I thought was quite provocative. And how would you respond to the theory and philosophy that comes up through Enlightenment and our constitutional debates, and John Stuart Mill and Oliver Wendell Holmes, etc. And that, do you think they would still have the same views if they were acquainted by these ideas, such as what Anthony's been talking about?
I'm sure they would. I mean, I think they're not unfamiliar with those kinds of concerns, although their conceptual apparatus for thinking about them and talking about them were different. But I don't think they'd be surprised by those kinds of arguments. And I don't think they'd be particularly persuaded by those kinds of arguments, at least not persuaded that it ought to make significant differences to what kind of commitments we have to free speech. I think I think these are real concerns, right? I mean, it's obviously the case that people can use speech for extraordinarily bad ends and can lead to those bad ends. There's a challenge about what you do about that, and then there's a challenge as well about whether or not it's a good idea to empower government officials, for example, to make decisions about what kind of speech to restrict. The entire history of censoring speech is precisely a history of saying some people are going to use speech very badly, and we, in the interest of the common good, are going to try to suppress that so that we don't get the bad outcomes that might emerge from that kind of speech. And you may be surprised to know that those with power to actually censor speech often like to censor the speech that challenges their power. And so I think you have to be really cautious about how you're going to empower censors and how they're likely to use it. And it's often the case that they're not going to use it in the way that you would hope. They're going to use it in different ways. And so I'm just extraordinarily skeptical of what good is going to come from empowering some people to be able to make those choices about what kinds of controversial speech we're going to allow and what kinds we're not. Having said that, I am totally with Anthony, though, in thinking that we've found ourselves in a weird cultural position of wanting to some degree create, but also celebrate so-called free speech martyrs in this sense, right? I mean, it's that there are a set of people that unfortunately, precisely because there have been efforts to suppress them, then allow them to posture as free speech martyrs and then try to emphasize values that we generally care about while obscuring their substantive commitments, which are often things we don't like very much, or we shouldn't if we were to look at them very closely. I think we ought to simultaneously avoid trying to suppress speech we don't like, but we should also avoid simply running into the arms of anyone who says, well, I'm in favor of free speech, and therefore you ought to listen to me. The fact that people have free speech doesn't mean then that there's any substantive need to actually think they're saying good things or useful things, that we ought to actually give them platforms or spend time listening to them. We need to make good choices about what kinds of speech we want to listen to, what kinds of speech we want to bring into the university environment, for example, which kinds of ideas we actually want to take seriously. And unfortunately, it is completely true that the free speech discourse is often a way of erasing some of the distinctions we ought to be making between what examples of speech are actually good and useful and productive, which ideas are worth hearing and thinking about, and which ideas simply are not and need to simply be rejected and ignored because they're not particularly helpful and they're not going to be useful to waste our time trying to grapple with them as opposed to focusing our attention on things that could be much more useful and interesting and productive in the long run.
Let me put it's not a hypothetical, it's a real, because it happened on my campus, and Keith and Anthony and I discussed it earlier before we let you all into the room. We had an incident in my institution, which is a small private Methodist affiliated liberal arts college just south of Des Moines, Iowa. We had an incident, I would say it's been about 4 years now, in which a professor in teaching a class used racial and anti-Semitic slurs in the classroom, not for the purpose of insulting anyone, but for the purpose of indicating and teaching the outrageousness of Native American slurs as professional sports teams' names. Now, it turned out that there were both students of color in the classroom and Jewish students in the classroom. They were quite upset. They went to the administration of the college. The administration called the faculty member in, who was an adjunct faculty member, did not have tenure, but had been part of our campus for decades, and talked to him and gave him some time to think. They did not fire him. They did not terminate him, but he ultimately decided to resign. I don't know the particulars of what on. I don't know if it was said, well, you could resign, or we will fire you, or we just want you to think about what's best for the institution. Both Anthony and Keith, could you give some thoughts about that? Again, understanding that as a private institution, we're not bound by the requirements of the First Amendment, although I should add that this is an institution that has always been open and accepting, and it's almost an effective First Amendment applies here at my college. Anthony, how do you feel about that scenario I just laid out to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, and I'm sure it's something similar is happening quite frequently in quite a lot of universities where we've got a kind of almost generational clash. And so one thing I would like to say, this is a bit of an oblique answer at first, but then I'll be more direct, is that I do think that let's call them millennials, the generation who've been going through the university for the last 10 years and are there now, in the UK, and I think this is the case in the US, are subject to like just grotesque stereotyping, misrepresentation. Just, you know, they're represented in the press, especially around free speech, as these both fascists and also as really weak, as both incredibly powerful, able to silence anyone, the woke mob, right? That's the language they use in the UK. There's the woke mob who are a threat to us all because of their politically correct ideas. And they are equivalent to fascists. They're like totalitarian in their righteousness, right? This is the argument made famously, and I'm a liberal professor and I'm scared of my students. I can't remember his name now, but yeah, at the same time, they've been subject to, you know, the worst economic crisis. I mean, they lived in a post 9/11 world, and then they live in this post 2008 financial crash world. They pay extortionate amount of money to go to university. I mean, in the States, for a lot of the universities, it's eye-watering the interest they have to pay on their student loans. You know, then they get into the job market, it's a nightmare. So I just think that the younger generation just get the terrible, terrible press. And I think that it would be not difficult for us to be just a little bit more sensitive to some of the issues that they're going through and their worldview. Having said that, that does sound like a bit of an overreaction to this professor who is clearly trying to illustrate a point. My own approach would be to be very cautious about any slurs that I would ever use. And if I ever had to, I would hyper qualify it, talk to the students, explain why I'm going to use it before using it, see how they feel about it. I'm just aware we live in a different world now. And you know, yeah, I mean, when I grew up, all sorts of slurs were totally normal, totally acceptable. They were used all the time in the playground, on TV, and they're not anymore. And I think it's not hard to just accept that and adapt. It would have been nice if the student and the professor could have just talked it through and worked it out. But, you know, the environment I inhabit for the last 3 or 4 years is really heightened. And I think it's on us, it's on our generation to be sensitive to that and to try and learn and learn from our students. So I have to say, ultimately, I would probably come down on the student side, however sympathetic I am to the professor, and I probably would do something similar potentially, and I could imagine getting in similar, probably not as bad, but so yeah, but you know, let's just listen to the new generation and their concerns and hear them out, and then then try and engage with them. But yeah, that'd be my position.
Thank you. Keith, I don't know, maybe perhaps you've had a similar incidents at Princeton. Your thought on what happened on my campus?
We have actually had a similar incident at Princeton, but moreover, the Academic Freedom Alliance is actively involved in several of these cases across the country right now. It is striking how many of these things are occurring, in part because I think we are seeing a genuine generational clash in which current students have one set of views about the appropriateness of ever using that kind of language, and you have much older faculty from a different generation and set of cultural expectations who have very different view about the appropriateness of that language in some context. I think we also see disagreements about the nature of the educational enterprise. And so you said, for example, that the faculty member here used racial slurs. There's, to borrow again from philosophy of language, an important distinction that gets made between the use of a word and the mention of a word. And I think in an educational context in particular, there's very little tolerance for use of racial slurs as slurs directed at students, for example, by a member of the faculty. And fortunately, those kinds of cases are extraordinarily rare. And the mention of the word in the context of trying to talk about a subject matter and explain the subject matter. So we've had examples of professors who've been fired or threatened with being fired for accurately quoting a court case they're trying to teach to students. They're teaching literature from the civil rights era in the 1960s, and they are quoting from the works of fiction that they've assigned students to read, or from the political essays they've assigned students to read, and then are threatened with being fired for having read aloud from the writings of Black activists from the 1960s who include that word as well as other slurs in their content. We've had faculty teaching communications classes and anthropology classes. They're trying to talk about the rise of various slurs in various contexts and how they're used and why they're a problem politically and sociologically. And then they've been threatened with being fired for mentioning the slurs they're trying to discuss in order to educate students about how language gets used. So we've got, unfortunately, a not very nuanced approach to how we often deal with these kinds of situations. And it has some real educational consequences as to subject matters that can be taught and how they're being taught. I do think faculty need to be much more careful in thinking about the current sensitivities of students. Part of the point of educating students is you need to be able to meet them where they are and not turn them off from the conversation. And unfortunately, I think some faculty are not nearly as careful about that as they should be. But on the other hand, we also need to, I think more carefully about, again, not only how you introduce controversial ideas, but sometimes controversial words into an academic setting and what it is we're trying to accomplish in an academic setting, and why we ought to be making some distinctions between how we conduct conversations in a seminar room as opposed to how such language might get used in a dorm room, for example.
Right. Let's go to the questions from the audience member. The first one is from Eric. Thank you, Eric, for the question. And it is directed to Anthony. Anthony, what changes are you advocating be made to free speech to prevent racism and other social ills? For example, the United States Supreme Court has established the counter speech doctrine, which we talked about a moment ago. And in the case of Whitney versus California in 1927, the Supreme Court stated, quote, "The remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence," unquote. Are you advocating for something other than the counter speech approach?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to have to, I mean, I try not to get pulled into the details of, discussions about what concretely to do about the issue. And I know that sounds really evasive, and it is, but my argument is that we need to shift the whole nature of the conversation, right? There's this conversation that's taking place in the mainstream press and also in universities, and it's taking our attention away from the real issue. And the real issue for me is, broadly speaking, inequality and all sorts of kind of structural prejudice. But concretely, to try and answer that question, so that's my evasive answer. I think we need to shift the whole angle of discussion and recognize that most of the discussion around free speech is this giant smokescreen preventing us from seeing how, you know, the ruling ideology is being legitimized and enabling the ruling class to maintain power and gain more money and more power, and on it goes. So, you know, basically what I'd advocate is revolution, but I realize that's not revolution, but a restructuring of society based around the axis of equality rather than freedom, right? That would be my very general argument. But concretely, no, I don't think counter speech works. I mean, I don't think enforced silence works, but I think what we need to prevent racism is, you know, it's a massive, massive topic, but we need an education. And what we need not to happen is to get drawn into these kind of controversies and to kind of have to take a position on this or that, but actually to just try and take a step back and have a deeper understanding of what racism is. Racism, in my view, it's misleading to think of it as a kind of individual act against another individual. We have to recognize that it's a kind of structuring system that derives from the Enlightenment period, which is when, you know, Europeans, white Europeans, came up with a categorization of humans which put white people at the top. And I think we still live in that world, unfortunately. I think that, you know, racism is a structural mode of seeing the world, of seeing things. And so I would want to have a much, much broader attack on racism rather than think about it solely in terms of the law. I mean, I should just quickly say, since this is the First Amendment week, I mean, I'm very sympathetic. I don't know if any of you have read a book by Aziz Rana, which is, it's called It's about American freedom. And he says, you know, there's a really positive element to American freedom and it enabled all sorts of really positive things, but the origins and the First Amendment in particular, you know, cannot be divorced from the conditions that enabled the freedom of the founding fathers to come about, which was slavery and the genocide of Native Americans, right? Like the indigenous people. The freedom that was foundational for the United States as we know it constitutionally is tied to those acts of enslavement and genocide, and that the Constitution needs to be seen in that context. And therefore, the First Amendment has, and I feel very uncomfortable talking about this as a British person to a crowd of Americans, because I realize it's kind of slightly sacred. But yeah, I think that Frederick Schauer argument is a really good one. There is a sense in which the First Amendment is almost, it operates almost tautologically. The First Amendment say it's true, therefore it's true. And I think maybe a little bit more interrogation of the First Amendment might be useful in the mainstream. I mean, in the public sphere, I'm aware it's going on in the universities, but yeah, it seems a bit dangerous. It's like the royal family in Britain. Like, you got rid of the royal family for good reason. I totally support that. Well done. You did it 200 years ago, and we still have it. And it operates in this almost, it has a kind of transcendental power that just brainwashes the people. And I worry, I'd like to know your thoughts, whether you think the First Amendment sometimes does play that role in the US.
I would say very quickly, Anthony, by the way, that during the last presidential administration, there were some Americans who thought that having Queen Elizabeth of the United States would not have been a bad idea after all. So, but yes, I know how many people feel in Britain. Keith, let me go to this question, and this is kind of off the topic of higher ed free speech, and I know we need to do it quickly because we're up against the time. This is a question from Charles, who has asked, Professor Whittington, I agree with your assertion that free speech need not be suppressed. What about it being amplified in ways that seem to favor the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable? And he goes into the example of social media has led to great amplification of hate speech. That is, but it's protected by Section 230 of our Communication Decency Act. And now with the reports this week that Elon Musk is bidding to purchase Twitter, does that, and in light of Citizens United, doesn't that seem to bode well for an equitably rewarding free speech ecosystem? core question, should Section 230 be upended to stem unhinged application of free speech? Amplification, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I don't have strong views about Section 230. I mean, I think the social media environment and how to best to structure it is a complicated and difficult issue, and I just haven't studied it enough to have very firm views about how to try to improve it. I do think it's a mess now. I think it creates problems as well as generating some really important and welcome accessibility to a wide range of voices that otherwise couldn't be heard. Frankly, some of the concerns we wind up having about social media is precisely because of it's so accessible to a wide range of voices we didn't previously hear from. And it turns out some of those voices we don't like very much. And so it's challenging as to how do you have create a platform and create a town square, a virtual town square that is fairly open and accessible while also being productive and helpful in the long run. I think it's a real challenge as to how to design these things. I think it's moreover a real challenge to how to design these kind of global platforms in this sense. I mean, part of the difficulty of social media as it exists now is they operate at a kind of scale that we've never dealt with before, not only in terms of both in terms of volume of how much stuff is being generated on social media, but also in its global sense. And as a consequence, it sort of makes content moderation extraordinarily difficult to do, even if you wanted to do it. And I don't think that's a problem that's going to be easily solved in merely modifying either policies within the tech companies or the law surrounding tech companies. Makes it any easier to solve the practical problem of what do you do about the fact you've got people posting from an extraordinary number of different cultural and social situations and at a volume that's just not possible for content reviewers to actually keep up with very effectively. I'm not terribly optimistic that social media is going to become better anytime soon.
Thank you, Keith. And Anthony as well. Julie, I'm going to hand it back to you in just a second. I just want to remind people, if you joined us late, our guests have been Keith Whittington of Princeton University and Anthony Leaker of Brighton University. Julie has put links to their books on these subjects in the chat, and I've been fascinated with both of them. And if you're fascinated in, I guess, continuing this debate, I'd highly encourage you to purchase both of them. And there, Keith, thank you very much. I appreciate your help today.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah, and Anthony as well. Have a great weekend in the sunny United Kingdom.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay.
Nice to meet you, Keith. Yeah.
Let me add my thanks to all of you. Brian, thank you for moderating so beautifully. And clearly we need more time to continue the discussion. It sounds like Brian's class is the place to be in order to do that in the fall at Simpson College here in Iowa. But I do want to thank you all for enlightening us with your expertise. We are moving on to our next session starting at 10 a.m. Iowa time. So those of you who are able to jump back on Zoom, please join us. But in the meantime, let's give a round of applause for our panelists here. And I wish you a very good weekend.
Can I just thank all the people who attended? That's so nice. Thank you for attending. It's, 9 o'clock in the morning to come and listen to. That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.